Thank you for joining me for episode 7 of Uncommon Voices, Uncommon Visions. I'm your host, Dr. Valerie Nyberg, and today I have attorney Thomas Newkirk on with me to discuss
implicit bias training and
some of the current issues that are happening in this arena in education, as well as in the state of Iowa. Mr. Newkirk, why don't you give us a start by giving us a little bit more about your background?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Nyberg, for inviting me on your program. My name's Tom Newkirk. I know you introduced me as an attorney. I'm a civil rights lawyer by trade. That's how I make my living. I've been doing that for 30 years here in Iowa, and have become, over the last 20 years, what I'll call a specialist in implicit bias and decision making, self-taught, outside, because there's really nothing about the law that helps me learn that. I had to learn it myself. I also became a student of history, in particular history of race and for African Americans in this country and other groups. And I use that to provide training and educational opportunities for organizations and individuals over the last, 10 years or so, in addition to my work as a lawyer.
Wow, that's impressive. So how did you get into that work?
Well, as I said, I started out as a lawyer and, I started doing some civil rights work, employment discrimination work. And here in Iowa, as you know, we're 94% white, but there are populations of color here, and I began to represent large numbers of African Americans relative to what other lawyers were doing. All the lawyers would send me cases for African Americans that, not exclusively, but particularly, and where they wouldn't have a case where there was a slur, like the N-word, things like that. A lot of lawyers, even today, will take that kind of a case if you're a person of color. They say a slur, they'll take your case because they get that. What I was taking were the cases where much more subtle, things we call today microaggressions. In other words, when you come to a meeting, people aren't shaking your hand, they're talking over you, they're not really engaging with you in the same way. They're watching you more closely at work. Why are you going to the bathroom? Why are you late? And yet whites wouldn't seem to be called out in the same way. And so I began to take those cases. And so as I got into those cases, I began to notice patterns in how, behavior would occur. Like I had enough cases with enough employers, and I would depose these people, meaning the employers. And I didn't believe racism was explaining it.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that racism was connected to it historically, of course, I got that, but
Right.
It wasn't the traditional understanding of racism. And so I began to see these patterns and began to then educate myself on, maybe there's another answer. So that's how I started down this road.
That's really fascinating. I'm just going to back up for a little bit. How would you define the traditional racism, or how it's traditionally understood, versus implicit bias and the patterns that you were seeing in your work?
Sure. And my knowledge or belief in this has evolved over time, of course. I was in the same view. I was in the same world as every other lawyer 25 years ago, trapped in this world of, okay, either if you do anything toward a person of color that is negative, you can only define that person's behavior by racism. But if you look historically at what racism is, racism means some type of consciously held, I believe blacks are inferior view of the world.
Right.
Overt prejudice, not the Klan necessarily, but yes, racism is the Klan, of course, but for the average person, people who have really strongly held prejudice and a belief that persons of color are not equal to whites, either culturally, genetically, just inherently, whatever you want to say. That's racism to me.
Okay.
And then there's consequences from racism that are kind of like ghost in the machine, which are things from our past and present that have seeped into the back of our brains of even very well-meaning, egalitarian, I want to do the right thing, I believe in equality people, just like me,
Right.
who can have that kind of implicit bias.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I wholly agree with you. And I think even as a Black person in America, I have had to confront some of those same issues in the way my mother raised me or the way that, my teachers interacted with me. So I think it's just part of the milieu that makes our society run the way it does. So having that delineation is really helpful, because I think more people would be more open to this message if they could make that distinction themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So it's my understanding that you offer many schools and school districts professional development sessions. How do you approach this topic? What do you say about not being an educator yet providing this training? And how do educators in the Midwest typically respond?
Okay. Well, let me back up for a second and say that one of the other moments in my life that got me into this work, that also I used during my trainings, is that about 22 years ago, around 22 years ago, when I first started to educate myself on bias issues, I was living in Iowa. I was a civil rights lawyer, representing lots of African Americans and other groups. And so I'm walking out of a grocery store, and it's about 9 o'clock at night, and behind me is an African American man. He's walking behind me out of the grocery store. Just pure coincidence. He's walking out the same time I am. I'm heading toward my car. As I move toward my car, I take my hand and I pat my wallet in the back of my, and I get in my car and I sit down. I say, like, why in the heck did I just do that? I don't get it. I don't believe I'm going to be robbed by an African American. I don't believe blacks are more likely to rob me. In fact, I believe that whites are probably more likely statistically to have robbed me. And plus, this guy's just walking out with his groceries. He didn't have some secret plan to rob the white guy of his wallet. But for some reason, subconsciously, my hand moved to my wallet, because I had black crime, black theft in the back of my brain as I understand it today. But at the time, I didn't really understand it. And so I began searching for an answer to say, if Tom Newkirk, so-called civil rights lawyer, who believes consciously in every way that African Americans and other groups are equal, it can do that, how many other millions of people are doing the same thing? Whether it's hands on wallets or it's marking down a different performance evaluation for an African American or other person, or it's or it's something else happening in the police, etc. So I began researching it, and I came across the inventor of the implicit association test, Dr. Coney Greenwald. We began talking, and then he invited me to Harvard University, and I went to Harvard, and I was the only lawyer in the room of law professors. Malcolm Gladwell was the author, social scientists who invented this thing, and we were all talking about how to bring this together. And I realized there weren't any other lawyers who really understood this, other than maybe a few academics who were just getting into it. And so that's my point is that I tell that story as part of my training, because that's how I got into it.
Yeah.
And I think it resonates with the persons in the room who not only people who look like me, but it also, I think, when persons of color hear that story, they say, oh, okay, I appreciate what you're saying. And so I've had, and so that's kind of how I start my trainings. And then I move into, and then I start every other training with what I'll call dealing with the 5 barriers to progress. In other words, that we can't make progress on this issue for some reason. We kind of make progress and we go backwards. And the reason, in my view, is that of how we look at the question of, in particular, race. And so I call it the 5 barriers. And the 5 barriers that I put in every presentation, whether it's for teachers, educators, social psychologists, or lawyers, judges, whoever I'm training, police officers, etc. There are 5 barriers to making progress. They are, number 1 is defensiveness. Every person, black and white, other shades of black and white, are defensive about the question of race. 2, it's polarization. And by that, I mean the way we interpret the conversation in an extreme way. It's never in the middle. It's always, okay, the police stopped more African Americans than whites for use of pot in Iowa. Bad numbers. Something's wrong with those numbers. So either A, all cops are racists, or B, something's wrong with the black people who smoke the pot. It's never in the middle. It's never like, therefore you've got to either interpret it as one or the other. And that's the way, as a lawyer, that's the way we were trained. Racism's evil. And if you're not racist, then you're not evil. And so, or you're not bad. And so The polarization is a big problem. The third barrier is a lack of knowledge of bias. I mean, the fact that I'm still trying to educate people today, and the fact that lawyers, I mean, I'm 20 years ahead of other lawyers because I've taught myself. And it's not an insult to the lawyers. There's no resources for them to learn it. They don't teach it in law school. I mean, they might just starting to do it, but even medical doctors don't really have knowledge. And I teach the classes at the Des Moines University with my friend, Dr. Rich Salas here in Des Moines on bias, but the lack of knowledge is a big barrier. The fourth barrier is what I call bias itself, that within the audience, there's going to be implicit biases within some of the room that can interfere with accepting what I'm saying. I mean, for example, there's a certain type of bias called zero-sum bias, that if you try and teach someone who looks like me, an in-group member, and for the audience members, in-group means white, 57-year-old heterosexual male lawyer. I'm the definition of the in-group in the United States. And so when you try and teach me that stuff, I'm resistant to it. In other words, I think that if you're trying to better the world for Black people, doesn't that make it worse for me? And so that kind of subconscious bias can actually make me resistant to it. And then the final barrier is what I call the overwhelming nature of the problem. And that means that, people throw up their hands. I mean, it's like, oh my gosh, we have to deal with so many kinds of bias and racism for African Americans. Then it's the police. Then it's, well, what about Asians? We forgot about Asians. They've been assaulted too. And, oh my gosh, I forgot about American Indians and Native Americans. And I forgot about, this population over here. And in all groups, but in particular members of the in-group, it becomes so overwhelming. You just want to throw up your hands and go back and do something else. And so what I've tried to do is, for every training, is to have people address those 5 barriers, and then I come up with a more efficient way of dealing with this problem by focusing on particular African Americans and women, who are independently the 2 groups that have the longest history of overt forms of discriminatory behavior toward them in the country. And they have the strongest forms of implicit bias that hang on to them even different, more than Latinx individuals, more than Asian individuals, more than any group other than maybe Native Americans. And it's close, that's what I would say. So that's what I do in terms of my training and everything, whether it's educators. So you asked me several questions, so I don't want to just keep talking, but go ahead.
Well, it's been my experience with educators, particularly, that when you don't have an educator background, or you're not in the classroom or haven't been in a classroom, that is one of those biases that they use to discredit or not fully embrace your message. So how do you, you were explaining kind of how you get past that?
Well, that's what I explained is kind of how I get past that in every situation. If I sent you my bio on this, I've probably in the last 5 years spoken now over 100 times to training or presentations or education, et cetera. I've told my story of my hand in my wallet probably 50 times or whatever of that 100 at least. Not every single time, but a lot of them. Not once has anyone ever accused me of being a racist when I tell that story. African Americans, I would say to people who look like me, and to educators, African Americans and other groups, they would like people to acknowledge the problem. You know what I mean? They're not going to be calling me a racist because I tell my story. But when I go to educators, my point is that in those 100 presentations, there's lots of times when people could take it differently because I'm not a teacher. Right. I'm not a police officer. I'm not African American. If I speak to the NAACP and other groups where it's all African Americans in the room, why is this white guy telling me this stuff? I mean, I can have it on all kinds of ways that people can act defensively, but I found that the messaging that I use is sufficient effective because they're going to break through those barriers. And for educators, for example, I don't walk into the secret dealing with, for example, educators and or sometimes the police. You've got to remember that I'm not equating them to the same, but the point is that educators and the police can be highly defensive because they're the tip of the spear. Like teachers just teaching kids day in and day out, they're overworked, they're not appreciated, regardless of their race, they're not appreciated. They're viewed as this "we take you for granted" thing. And the police sometimes are treated that way too,
Mhm.
and they feel like the entire weight of the civil rights movement is on their shoulders.
Mhm.
And if you walk into the room and you say, "Look, no one's here calling every teacher a racist. I'm not doing that because I know not every teacher's a racist, and not even close." The
Right.
thing is, there are some racist teachers in the world, just like there are racist lawyers and racist cops and racist judges. But if you deal with it and get them to break down these barriers and realize that I'm engaging perhaps in biased decision making that can adversely affect the educational experience of a student. And I can also explain to them how their behavior can also not only harm African Americans and Native Americans or kids of color, but it also can actually harm, young women who
Mhm.
may be white. In other words, if we're if we view women as not being great in STEM, scientific, math,
Right.
etc.
That's
Um,
exactly where I went.
right. In other words, if we view them that way, we're going to be kind of like pushing them over to more of a social, soft way of thinking about their futures. And young men are pushed into science and technology, and 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 it can actually harm all groups. And so that's kind of just some of the ways that I talk to teachers. I've had very, very good. I would just say, when you ask, I've had no trouble at all with educators or groups accepting my message and being positive about it. I don't think I've had a single so far negative review that I've known about from anyone saying, what's this guy doing? He's saying that all teachers are horrible or whatever, because I'm not doing that. I've had some pretty tough conversations with teachers, because when you look at the data
Mhm.
about how education treats, in particular, African American young men and women and Native Americans, it's pretty disturbing in terms of suspensions and discipline and things like that, and how it interferes with their education. And then nobody really does anything about it. And yet, then the reason why, in my opinion, is because of those 5 barriers. That if, for those audience members, that we can think of it this way: if I'm a teacher, I'm a white teacher. Let's say I really work hard. I I don't get my summers off like everyone thinks I do. I mean, I'm
Right.
working hard. It's a tough job. It's low appreciation. Sometimes parents just expect me to babysit their kids and handle them. I got to do all that stuff. And yet, you want me to admit that I'm racist as well in order to even start to make progress to help better the educational process. I'm not going to make that admission. If you force me into that corner, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to say, that's not me. Or,
Right.
well, you must be talking about somebody else, so I guess there's no problem. And so anyway, those are just some ideas I use to kind of reduce the defensiveness and the barriers that exist within educators.
Awesome. Awesome. Um, so even when you're doing your best and you're employing these techniques, what does it look like, or what does it sound like when someone is not ready to hear that message, or not ready to do that work?
Yeah, I will say I was fortunate to be selected to do training with the Iowa Law Enforcement Academy here in Iowa. I mean, there was, and one of my first sessions, it was virtual, but I asked that it be in person, because I don't like, doing it virtual is hard because you just
Yeah.
can't connect with people. And, sometimes, like, I do the same thing. All of a sudden I'll lose my thought in the middle of something because I'm talking to a camera lens and I just can't get it going. I need to have people I can look at or see in the room. And so I want to make sure I can have people live. So I had these officers come in, and I had a room of about 60 officers who were live.
Mhm.
Everyone else was virtual. And these officers walked in for their first bias training with me, and they were arms crossed, defensive, like looking at me like this, like, what do you know? And what I tried to do was, I figured the audience would be kind of like that. And not being critical of police officers for feeling that way. I'm just saying that that's what was going to happen. And they were that way. And the body language was clearly, I'm not positive I want to hear what you have to say.
Right.
And so what I had done when my training was to talk about, hey, here's a video of the Des Moines police kneeling when George Floyd protests were going on, and everyone applauded them. And you could just feel the warmth when you see that video, the idea that the police are on the same side as people who want this to stop. In that
Right.
moment of emotion, and I kind of like started my presentation with that, to kind of like say, hey, look, you think everybody's accusing you of being racist, and yes, many people may be, partly because there isn't any other way to talk about it. And just for Dr. Nyberg, I'm not being critical of any African-American or other person who's experienced racism for using that labeling. I get it. In society, whether you're lawyers, doctors, no matter how educated you are, you're not given another way of talking about the effect of race on a decision-making process other than by saying that's racism.
Right.
But there are other ways to talk about it, in my view. So anyway, that's kind of one way I kind of overcame the defensiveness. The thing about educators is most of them they know they need to have this training, and they're normally pretty open to it. You may have a different experience, Dr. Nyberg, because, as a woman of color, you're trying to talk to, I know you were in Iowa. And so, like I said, it's maybe a little different, but so far I've had some success in breaking through, and the law enforcement is probably the most defensive audience that I've had. But if you give them a chance, they open up.
Oh, absolutely. I actually have done some training with law enforcement in the Iowa City area as part of one of the positions I held in Iowa City. So it's always very interesting to see those parallels. And I like how you phrased it in terms of they're at the forefront of that work. They're kind of the face of the work, and then yet they're being called to perform that work in different ways than they were prepared to do it, and how confronting that can be. So yeah, that was a good point.
If I may, for the one thing to think about in terms of like law enforcement, is to remember this: there is almost as little training as there is for lawyers on bias and how to prevent it. There's even less for law enforcement.
Yeah.
And I'm doing some of that training, and so you can't ask a person, whoever that person is, to go out in the street and try and manage their biases when you're not even training them on how to manage their biases, even assuming the science suggested you can manage your biases, which the science is a little iffy on whether that's even possible. So the point is that you've got to give people the education necessary to make a difference. And, like I said, when lawyers don't get it and doctors don't get it, and they have no excuse not to have the time to educate themselves, I'm not blaming teachers or police officers or other groups that are only given one training a year, maybe, to try and manage this thing. So I just the increasing support for education is a way to attack this issue. So
yes, and I think that, and the fact that they have high pressured, quick decision making positions that have a lot of responsibility with not necessarily the economic or social reward are also another way of really contextualizing that whole position and kind of the things that we've done in our society to not necessarily help people do the best work that they can do at all times.
Very good point. Yes.
Yeah. So like many states, Iowa signed into law last summer the House File 802. What is your perspective on this and similar state legislation?
Sure. So the House File 802 in Iowa is really the don't engage in diversity and inclusion training in schools or in public entities. Like, for example, anything that receives state funding or the state has control over. They can't do this to private employers, but they do it for things like schools, and that's the big one, and other state agencies, that you can't engage in certain types of training. And so my read on it is that it's really about instructing people not to claim. It doesn't say it directly, but it says don't claim whites are inherently racist. That's really what the law is really focused on. Now, I will say to you, as a woman of color that will understand this, that it's unfortunate because obviously, for 250 years in this country, we have never once suggested, other than by, the idea of it's immoral to do it or it's wrong to do it, we've never once passed laws that says a white person couldn't say that blacks are inherently inferior to whites. But I have a right to say that if I want to say it. Right? It's free speech. But the idea that we would pass a law that says you can't say something that whites are inherently a certain way, while we don't do the same thing. In other words, if you want to pass a law like this, then pass a law that says no one can say anyone is inherently racist, and you would focus on, in particular, the free speech of groups that are really hate groups. Why are we letting them have their free speech? I mean, I understand why we let them have their free speech, so I get my free speech. But it seems interesting to me that you want to put handcuffs on persons who are training, who may say things or imply things that one group's inherently a certain way, while we're not stopping it on the other side of it. So I think that this law is primarily a fear response. Have no sympathy, please. I'm not asking for sympathy for people who look like me. I can tell you that people who look like me have sometimes a fear response that it's even subconscious, like if this keeps going the way it's going, I'm going to lose my position in society of being king of the hill. That's subconsciously what people think. It's called zero-sum bias. I mentioned it earlier.
Right.
And, a lot of people can overcome it. Like I said, I view it as, for example, my position as a member of the in-group, I work very hard. I work 7 days a week. I work as hard as anybody can work to get the things that I've done. But still, I'm certain I get the benefit of the doubt sometimes. I get a little access. Of course I do, because I'm a member of the in-group. But I think that it's for people that look like me, they need to kind of like just relax and realize that, how inclusivity, in other words, that bias training, if you're afraid of losing your power, well, someday you're going to be in the minority. Do you really want to tell all the minorities who may be in the majority someday that, hey, you all should pass a bunch of laws against us 30 years from now because we're doing it to you? I mean, it doesn't make any sense, in my opinion. But to what I do, just to kind of connect this to the training issue, my training actually doesn't conflict with this law, because I don't say anybody's inherently anything.
Right.
Whites aren't inherently racist. Whites aren't inherently biased. We all have susceptibility to implicit forms of bias, and we all have susceptibility to implicit forms of racism. Do I see very many African-American racists? No, I really don't. But it's not because you're Black. It's not because I'm white. It's because in a society where I'm a member of the in-group, it's not, I just haven't seen it very often. I mean, you can see occasionally there's some resentment, like, maybe toward a group, African-American have resentment toward a person who's white. That's true. I don't view that as racism, personally, reverse racism. And so I just don't call anyone inherently anything. And so therefore my training is more about bias exists, it's real. At this stage of our society, it harms some groups more than others. Clearly harms African Americans more than any other group. Native Americans to some extent, harms women to a large extent. And so that's kind of how and no one's ever challenged my training to say, it violates this law, because what they're passing it for wasn't to deal with what I'm saying. So that's what I would say.
Okay. Well, and I agree it's a fear response. And I think that goes along with my next question about critical race theories and the current concerns that people have about that and parents have about what the school system is teaching their kids. What role do you think that those concerns play in all of this and in implicit bias itself?
Well, it's interesting that the laws that have been passed and the challenges. See, I view critical race theory as just an interesting intellectual, academic approach. It's about, I think, at least 30 years old. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing wrong with it. It
started in law.
Right. I believe it to be a little bit outdated in its evaluation of how the problems exist and what to do about them. So I don't talk about it because I don't talk about a lot of theories that were really cool at the time and really powerful at the time, but have no application in today's world, in my opinion. And so, but if one of the reactions has been that, and this is the danger of polarizing the question of race. Mm-hmm. When one political party, shall we say, has a group of people who are truly racist who will vote that party. I mean, true racists are not voting in the Democratic Party. But the problem is that if you say that means all Republicans are racist, that creates that, first of all, not true. And second of all, it's going to create that polarizing theory where they're being defensive and they're saying, so, and that makes them look for something like, why are you accusing all of us just because we're more conservative and just because just because we can't stop the Proud Boys from voting Republican if they want to vote here, why are you calling all of us racist? And they start to look for a scapegoat, and that's critical race theory. And I will say, just for a moment of politics, like, there is no better political party at taking an idea and framing it and arming it into a weapon than the Republican Party. And I mean that, unfortunately, but also it's a weird compliment that Democrats are not very good at that stuff. We're not good at taking an idea and turning it into a weapon for our side. And so, I mean to let you know that I'm a Democrat, but maybe you figured that out. Anyway, so I think that's where it comes from. And I think that the key is if you buy into it and you worry about it, I think that it feeds it. You kind of feed the problem if you keep arguing about it. That's why I'm saying just, hey, critical race theory is interesting. It's outdated by 30 years. We got better ideas over here. Let's go figure it out. That's how I look at it.
Right.
It just kind of defeat because the groups that really want to fight about it, they want that tension. They want people to be afraid of the brown horde. That's what they want them to be afraid of. And if you feed into that, it just makes it easier for them to deliver that message, in my opinion. But again, and by the way, to people listening, I understand that my role as an in-group member, I can make certain arguments, maybe that Dr. Nyberg or someone else couldn't make or wouldn't make, or doesn't feel like making. For example, I don't blame anyone for fighting hard against that view, but I'm just saying that I approach it in a certain way because I think that there's a way to get around it and break through the barriers that are created intentionally by the group that's making critical race theory into some imaginary demon.
And I agree. I think in my work, I've often had conversations with my colleagues about the reason why I position myself a certain way, or the reason why I talk about an issue a certain way. And it has to be strategic for the audience in order to get past those natural defenses, to get past those natural inclinations to be armed up. And that not everyone has to do that. I acknowledge that for other people, because I'm not trying to say to someone like you, that's not fair or not right. It isn't, but it's an acknowledgement of the status quo. And I think when you understand the status quo, you can better dismantle the status quo, as long as you're willing to talk about it and be honest about what it is. And I think that to me is more part of the work that we're doing or trying to do is bringing these really hard topics into something that is an honest conversation between and amongst ourselves, so that we can emerge from that conversation better prepared and better stewards of the conversation, and to the betterment of everybody.
That's an excellent point. I agree with you completely. It's like, just got to find a way to have a conversation that people can hear, and then people will come together. I believe that's true.
I believe that is true too. Well, we're almost out of time. So I'm just going to ask you, for people looking to learn more about this topic, what resources can you recommend?
I would encourage people who want to know about this to, you go to Project Implicit, which is an online resource. You can look up what the implicit association test is. Remember that if you take the implicit association test, which is just it's a peer-reviewed test to expose the potential for subconscious forms of bias that may exist in your brain. If you test strongly biased toward African Americans, it doesn't mean you're a racist. It doesn't mean you're not a racist. I mean, whether you're a racist probably, or if you test strongly biased toward women in leadership roles, doesn't mean you're a sexist. It does mean that you may have forms of implicit bias hidden in the back of your brain that you need to do something about, as many people do. So use that, do some reading on, what implicit bias is. And I would also encourage, in particular, people who look, and I've also encouraged this of people of color, because it's not just whites who need education on how bias works. I just talked to a woman the other day, a lovely human being, African-American woman who was suffering from, microaggressions at work. She'd never heard of implicit bias before. She only had one word to describe what was happening to her, and that was racism. She didn't have any access to other ways of talking about it. She couldn't identify it. She didn't know how to, she couldn't describe it, not because she's not sufficiently intelligent to do so. It's not that. She wasn't trained on the language, as are many whites not trained on the language. So if you can train yourself as a person of color and a woman and other groups on these issues, you can begin to identify how bias works. You'll begin to see it more clearly and to know what's racist and what's not racist and what's fixable and what's not.
Right.
The second resource one of the things that I taught myself in the last 20 years is something they don't teach you in schools, back to education. Nobody teaches kids, even in college, of the fundamental of the 100 years of racism and Jim Crow and that type of thing that happened from 1867 after the Civil War until 1967 and 1969. Mm-hmm. You have to go read that history, and there are books you can read to kind of help you appreciate the impact of that on not only African American culture. In other words, why are Blacks nervous about testing? Why are African Americans nervous about the police? Why are whites like this? Why are we so sensitive? Why are there biases that exist today? All of the implicit biases that exist today aren't just magically appearing. You can actually connect them to that historical background, which is why it's not wrong to think of bias as being sourced from racism. It clearly is. If we have an implicit bias that an African American must not be quite as smart, so therefore I'm not going to judge him or her in being an IT director in the same way I would a white person. Well, that came from 200 years of people saying Blacks are inferior to whites.
Right.
That's where it came from. Even if I don't believe it, it's just hidden in the back of my brain a little bit. So if you understand that it comes from there are about 8 to 12 overt racist and stereotype views of Blacks from the old days that have been, yes, still exist today in some of us, but in most of us, if it exists at all, it's going to be floating in the back of our brain. And if you understand that, you can get your brain around this issue of race, and for African Americans in particular. Then you can start to expand your knowledge for Latinx individuals and Asian individuals, and also helps you do a whole host of things. So I encourage you to read history of race, as well as educating on bias, and you begin to see the connection. So those are two sources I'd recommend for everyone.
So for history of race, do you have a text that you would recommend?
I believe people should look at, I'm trying to remember the guy's name. I haven't read it in a while, but it's, I'm drawing a blank. Gunnar Myrdal is the social psychologist who wrote a 2-volume set on the impact of race on African Americans back in the 1940s. Mm-hmm. And I encourage people to go at least pick up that book. You can pick it up on, used books for $5, and it's a 2-volume set or whatever you do. And you can look at it and see in 1945 what was going on. 1945 isn't that long ago. I mean, right. People are alive today in 1945, and that's what was going on for Blacks. So it's not like it's 300 years ago. So that's one resource. I'm drawing a blank on the other author who, gosh dang it, I'll try and send it to you, but he writes, he writes books that are historically connected, but told a little bit more story-like. And so like when he interviews and he talks about an African-American raised in Jim Crow South, talking about hearing from that African-American's voice in that time, it's very, very compelling. And Leon Letwek is his name. Okay. And he's written several books on this issue, and I recommend that as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for your time. And this has been really illuminating. And I am impressed with your knowledge and your understanding of how fraught these issues can be, particularly for the things that we're experiencing right now, where we are, our culture and our country is polarized. And so many of us want a better outcome, but don't know how to get there. So I appreciate the work that you're doing, and I appreciate your time with me today.
Thank you, Dr. Nyberg. Thanks very much for having me, and it's been a pleasure, and look forward to talking to you in the future, and as your audience continues to expand. This is because there's very important topics, and not everybody's taking it on, in this way. And so, kudos to you.
Well, thank you very much. Again, this is Uncommon Voices, Uncommon Visions, and this is Dr. Valerie Nyberg, your host. Thank you for listening. Feel free to like, share, and comment. And thank you very much for lending us your time.
Thank you.